Do you want to know how you can use a podcast for business development? Well, that's what we're talking about in this video today, so stay tuned. Hey there, I'm Mark Brown with Editor's Keys, and today I'm joined again by James Mulvany from podcast.co. In this series we've been talking about how you should start a podcast, how you can get guests, and today we're going a bit more into the business strategy, the business development side of things. So welcome again, James. It's really good to have you.
Yeah.
Oh, you're more than welcome. So, as I say, we've talked about all of these subjects, about why you should have a podcast, how you can start, how you can get it up onto all the different platforms. But today I want to talk to you about actually using a podcast as a business development tool, because I know there'll be a lot of business people out there who kind of want to do a podcast, but deep down they want to use it as a way of developing their business and taking their business further. So, let's just jump straight into it. How can you use a podcast as a method of business development?
Well, I think the first thing is, we mentioned this in the early videos, but effectively, podcasting is a great marketing tool. There's multiple benefits to it. You might be reaching audiences that you haven't previously reached, which is good for business development, because ultimately you want to try and cast your net as far and wide as you can, but ultimately still be talking to relevant audiences. There's no point of putting a message out there to customers who aren't going to convert ultimately. So, that's the key. Is really when you're interviewing your guests or when you're planning your episodes, think about your target audience. Think about potentially how you can reach people you're not already reaching. Yeah. So ultimately, if you've got a commercial message to say, don't make your podcast just constantly about that message. We've said this earlier, like you need to make sure you're delivering value and actually, doing something that's interesting and engaging for your audience, but there's no harm in getting a commercial message in there. The key thing to remember is put a call to action in. If you want your audience to take a certain action, e.g. buy a product, sign up to a mailing list, subscribe, etc., remember to put that content in there. Maybe put it in at the beginning, middle and end. Don't be afraid to sort of say that, but ultimately I think there needs to be more than just a commercial message. Podcasts do need substance. So that's one thing to remember.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think with podcasts, it's definitely a good way to engage with a different kind of sector of your user base. I know that when people think, I've got a YouTube channel already, I've got a blog already, I don't need to do anything else. But there are people who just don't like watching YouTube, or they just don't like reading a blog. So a podcast is a real good way of sort of meeting those people where they're at already.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's be honest, it's interesting. I was having a conversation yesterday. Not everyone likes listening to podcasts too, but it's another medium of communication. It's something you can add to your marketing mix that will ultimately engage with people in a different way. You've got a lot longer to communicate with someone in a podcast. That's factually proven, so rather than just thinking, we've got to quickly get this message across in 30 seconds because that's all people pay attention to videos for, suddenly you have 20 minutes. So you can go into real detail about perhaps your product, your service, and maybe even talk about the reasons behind it as well. So rather than just saying, this is what we offer, it's a great opportunity to tell your story and build on, what the reasons where you create that product in the first place, or the history of your company, or just imparting as much knowledge as you can about a specific topic, and which is going to be beneficial to your customer base ultimately.
Yeah, definitely. And I think that's one reason why, I follow people like Gary Vee or people like you. You do want to hear a little bit of the behind the scenes maybe, and I think a podcast is a good place for that, because you maybe know the business, but you want to find out where they're taking the business, or what they do to promote their business, and I think a podcast helps you delve a bit deeper into that. So yeah, I would probably say, from our point of view, we don't want to be sitting on a podcast just talking about buy a keyboard, buy a mic, it's the best mic ever. We want to talk about why we, like you've said, why we built this keyboard.
Another thing you can do is behind the scenes look into your company, and this helps build trust massively. Show what's actually happening behind the scenes, because again, lots of people can learn from that. You attract a different kind of audience, and I think it really helps with authority as well. There's lots of companies who have done this very, very successfully, and actually there's some companies that have basically been built from the founder having such a good, strong personal brand because they've been doing this behind the scenes kind of content. It automatically will put you out there in the industry and kind of position you as, yes, this guy really knows what he's talking about, or girl, and ultimately then they can be you know, sort of top of their game type stuff, people then will naturally be drawn towards someone like that because, you know, think, okay, well, I trust this guy. He knows what he's talking about. So maybe I'm going to give him the business rather than someone else. Yeah. You know,
it's definitely. I mean, in all sorts of businesses, you know, there's shady characters.
Yes,
and then,
of course.
Yeah, and then when you do a podcast or a YouTube channel or something like that, you kind of put more cards on the table. Everyone can see every element of your life, so they can really pick every part of you out. So I think, yeah, the trust factor really goes to another level because they're seeing.
And ultimately as well, remember that you know, audio is the oldest form of communication, and podcast is audio. So we were talking to each other as humans long before we were writing, long before we were, you know, on camera. So it's a fantastic way to kind of go really deep, basically.
Yeah, definitely. And so, I mean, let's go into guests as well. Yeah. So, from a business perspective, in the last video we talked about how to get guests on a podcast, but how can you use guests, and I mean use in a nice way, but is there a way of getting a guest on your channel which actually helps you develop your business further? Precisely,
yeah. I mean, you've really hit the nail on the head there, Mark. One of the things, you know, people are doing more and more is using podcasts specifically as an outreach tool. So let's say you want to get through to, you know, the operations director of a company because you're trying to sell them a product, you know, which that they might use. If you kind of approach that company and say, oh, I need to speak to, even if you know their name, the chances of you getting through to that person are very, very slim these days. You know, there's gatekeepers, there's people sort of, you know, are very busy, they don't respond to emails. However, if you suddenly turn around and say, yeah, look, I want to interview this person for my podcast, suddenly, you know, he or she is more likely to be like, oh, wow, yeah, because I think, you know, number one, everyone wants to tell their story. Quite a lot of people are ultimately like trying to push themselves and sort of get themselves out there and grow their personal brands or talk about their businesses. So immediately, it's a great way to get through to the decision makers in businesses.
Definitely. And I think, you know, I feel like a lot of people may be thinking, okay, podcasting or YouTube is oversaturated, but it really isn't. I mean, I've probably only had 1 or 2 calls about being invited onto a podcast, but I probably get 20, 30 calls a day about, can you buy this product or service from us? So I'm much more likely, I think, even personally, if someone was to invite me onto a podcast, you know, you're gonna take the call for one, and then if you're on that podcast, you're gonna at least have had that maybe half an hour chat with that person. You now know that person.
Exactly. That's the thing, isn't it? You know, and I think, again, you don't have to be super salesy when you're talking to someone. Ultimately, you know, they're giving you the time, so interview them, try and learn from them, have a great conversation and try and build as much of a relationship as you can. But then ultimately, you've got their email address normally by that stage, so you can kind of follow up with them maybe a week or 2 later. And again, kind of give something before asking for something back. So wait till the episode's live and say, look, you know, the episode's live. If you wouldn't mind pushing it out to your channels as well, like I mentioned before, good way to sort of reach even more people. Get them to do that. And at that stage is when you should say, right, you know, is there any chance that we could have a chat about X or Y? You know, certainly we've found as well, as a production company, it's a good way to acquire production clients, especially if someone's on the fence about starting a podcast, say, and you can say, well, look, come in, let's interview on my podcast, give them that sort of experience. You know, they then feel a bit more comfortable with it, they can see the benefits, and you know, you're more likely to say, right, okay, look, we can help you with your own podcast if we're selling podcasting, or if indeed anyone watching is interested in doing this as a business. You're adding it to an existing production agency. It's a fantastic way to acquire clients, I think.
So yeah, I think that's an interesting point. And when you have a guest on, it's all about the guest as well. You know, when you normally, like, just say I was to call a shop that I want to stock Editor's Keys products, the call would really have to be about, please, can you take the products on board and can you take a look at our product line? Whereas if I was to invite, say, the head of that shop in to talk about their 100-year history as a store, it's all about them. So it's great for our listeners. You know, they're going to learn something about this maybe amazing musical store. The person who's been interviewed is going to be happy about it, and of course I think they're going to feel more likely to want to then at least have a chat with me about the Editor's Keys products being in a store, for
yeah,
example.
and also as well, I suppose the argument there is you can say to that person, look, now you've been on the podcast, our audience know about you, and therefore are more likely to buy our product from you when they see it on your shelves, because there's that kind of connection going on. That's that brand association, which I think is very, very powerful.
And it's a win-win for everyone, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because it is definitely a two-way street. I think when earlier I said, how can you use guests? It can sound a bit like harsh, like a shady business tactic, but it's not at all, because you're getting someone on about them. They're happy
Giving
to
them
do
promotion.
that. Giving them promotion for free. You're going to be promoting that podcast for probably many months to come, years to come, and you've built that relationship. And I think in business, that's probably the hardest thing, is actually building relationships with people.
Yeah. I think it's a very good point to make, isn't it? And again, if you sit down with someone, this is really, if you look at what, like, traditionally the way of building business, 30 years ago, for example, you take someone out for lunch, or your business was done on the golf course, right? Nowadays, business is done by interviewing people in podcasts. It's the same thing. The difference is, rather than having that conversation about their history on the golf course, you're recording it and sharing it with your audience. But it's a really, really similar sort of strategy, I guess.
Yeah. And I found as well, when we've done interviews for the channel, the YouTube channel, it's nice actually, because when you run a business like you do and I do, you can get a bit kind of locked into the business and you don't see out of the four walls. So I personally just enjoy all of this, because you're meeting passionate people who are in the same business sort of category or line of work as you do, and you're learning, which I love. But you're just I just love building these relationships with people, because you just don't get to do it in a normal sort of day-to-day work.
I agree, and ultimately as well, there's that phrase, isn't there, like, keep your competitors close. I think sometimes, you obviously everyone's got competition. So actually, sometimes speaking to people in the same industry, you can learn from them. So what are they doing differently to you, or potentially even like, what could you duplicate in your business? So, there's another layer to it there, I think. Yeah,
definitely. And we've even on that sort of area, we've got very kind of like close, they're not even competitors, but they are people that you would normally see as a competitor. And then when you have that chat with them, you realise actually there's a couple of ways we could work together on this or this. And
selling complementary products rather than like, they're not selling editors keyboards just like you, but they're maybe selling something that kind of sits alongside that product, and therefore actually, you have the same kind of target market. And again, I suppose the benefit there is, once that podcast goes live, they're sharing it with their audience. You're reaching more customers, so it's a win-win.
Yeah. So now we're talking about this as a strategy. The person watching is going to be up for doing this. What are kind of some of the do's and don'ts when you kind of reach out to these guests when you want to get them on board?
Well, first of all, be friendly. Be quite direct, and ultimately try and sort of talk about the benefits. I think the main thing to do is say, why you want them on as a guest, what value you think they can provide to your audience, what you think that they could talk about, or if you said perhaps you want them to talk about like the history of where they've got to where they are, and just try and tailor each interview for that guest as well. So I think that's the easiest way of doing it. There's no, again, I think sometimes people need a bit of reassurance that don't worry, you're going to get to okay it before the episode goes live. We'll make it sound good. If there's any bits that if there's anything you don't feel comfortable talking about or you don't want to discuss, then please let me know. So it's just about being transparent, I think, throughout the whole process.
And there's a bit of a myth. I've seen some of our comments before. Someone said, how much did you pay to get this guest on here? I'm curious. Right, There's a bit of a myth that you have to pay everyone to be on your channel.
I mean, I think generally, from my experience anyway, people are more than happy to appear, because it's free promotion. They're trying to get their message out there as much as you are. So, generally speaking, you're not paying people. I think even when you look at big podcasts like Joe Rogan, he gets some top names on there. Is he paying them? I very much doubt it, because he's got such a big reach. It's only going to do a positive thing for the person he's interviewing, even if they're a top A-list celebrity. So I think it's kind of, it balances out, and again, quite often you can do podcast exchanges as well. So you could say, look, I'll interview on my podcast. If you've got a podcast, I wouldn't mind coming on yours as well. And that's a fair exchange. That's quite a common thing. The other thing you can do with podcasts as well, from business development perspective, is swap promotion. So like cross promote each other. So even if you don't have a guest on, think about what podcasts your audience might also like to listen to, and do an exchange. Effectively, it helps grow your audience, and it's a good way of getting the word out there even further.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and it's got me thinking as well. In terms of beating your own business competition, I guess having a podcast and getting in with these guests really does help you beat your competition in a way.
I think it gives you the edge, doesn't it? Because ultimately there's still very few brands out there that are podcasting. So, from a commercial perspective, if you leave it another year or another 2 years, the chances are some of your competitors will have got a podcast. And ultimately I think there's another advantage of you'll be seen as kind of cutting edge. It's a good idea to be seen as, proactive, and it's cool when your customers see you doing cool new stuff, basically. So, if you leave it for the competition to do, the perspective will be shifted to them rather than having that kind of win.
Definitely, and I think whatever industry you're in, when you think about podcasting, really, no matter what you're in, even if you're in say accountancy again. Your job as an accountant is really to offer advice in some way. So you should have a podcast offering advice. We have a channel we have a product which is all about video editing and audio recording. And so if we're not audio recording or video editing ourselves, I think it kind of makes you look a bit bad in a way.
I think it depends on industry, doesn't it? Like if you look at something like accountancy or financial advice or law, these are very traditional, sort of slightly old school industries. Some of which still haven't really even got like a social media presence. So again, if you want to be seen as pioneering, you want to attract, let's say you're an accountancy firm and you want to attract more high technology companies, having a podcast is a great way to kind of reach those audiences, and do it in a modern means versus sort of the traditional means of, maybe sending out mail shots or whatever that actually, I get paperwork through the post every day and I just completely ignore it. If I suddenly see there's a hot new accountancy firm in town, they've got an amazing podcast, they're interviewing lots of interesting business leaders from my area, suddenly I'm going to pay attention to that, right?
And it goes back to that value factor as well, doesn't it? If you're, say, based where we are in the Manchester region and you're, say, buying a house and you want mortgage advice and you get a podcast which is about mortgage advice, and this podcast person is based in Manchester and you love the value they've given you, I mean, the chances of you giving that person an email or a call is sky high.
Yeah, absolutely, as a customer, because you feel like you already know them, even if you've never met them before. And it's sometimes strange, isn't it? Because I don't know if you've ever done this before, if you've watched a video of someone, or if you listen to a podcast, and then you meet that person face to face, and it almost feels weird, doesn't it? It's almost like they're a sort of celebrity, even though they're just like a normal person, just like you or I. But you kind of suddenly like, oh wow, that's the guy from the video, or that's the guy from the podcast. So I think there is a benefit to, building relationships, not only with the people you're interviewing, as we mentioned before, but definitely 100% building relationship with the audience, whether that's your existing customers or potential new customers.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think if you've got a business, it's definitely something worth considering. You should really think about getting guests on your channel. So thanks so much, James. I mean, this has been so helpful. If you want to start a podcast, watch the entire playlist from the start, because as I mentioned, we go through everything from why you should have a podcast as a business, how you can get recording, how you can get guests, and the right way to do it as well, because there's a lot of wrong ways.
Yeah, and ultimately as well, the best advice just to finish up is just to get started. Like it's like most things in life, you can think about it till the cows come home, but take action. Get your first series off the ground, start sending some emails, trying to get some guests in, and just get going.
So if people want to find out more about your businesses, where can they find out about that?
So you can find out more about us by visiting podcast.co. We offer a platform which allows you to start a podcast very quickly and easily, and we also offer a full range of production services as well. If you're interested in booking really high profile guests, then check out matchmaker.fm. It's free to sign up, and you can connect using your LinkedIn profile and start booking those all important guests for your podcast immediately. Or if you're not ready to full on start a podcast, just start appearing as a guest on some, because it's a good way to actually kind of get stuck into the industry. Matchmaker.fm.
Well, thanks very much, James. I'm sure we'll have you again on the channel very, very soon. Thank you for watching. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, hit that notification bell, and we'll see you in the next video.